Hi, my name is Chris Brennan with the astrologyschool.com, and the purpose of this video is to talk about the astrological significance of eclipses. Alright, so let's get right into it. So right now, lately, there's been a lot of discussion about the so-called Great American Eclipse. There's a lot of news articles about it, and there's also a lot of discussion about what does this mean, not just from an astronomical standpoint, but also what does it mean in terms of astrology? And there's a lot of people perhaps that are first thinking about this topic or might be introduced to the topic of astrology just from wondering, if the current eclipse has any sort of broader significance or meaning in terms of world events or in terms of their life or personal life in general. So I wanted to make a video to talk a little bit about that topic and talk a little bit about how eclipses are viewed within the context of natal astrology. So much of the discussion about the current eclipse that's about to take place on August 21st, 2017, that eclipse, a lot of the discussion has been focused on the fact that the path of the total eclipse and the shadow of the eclipse crosses almost the entire continental United States. So most of the discussion has been centered on things surrounding what's called mundane astrology, which is the application of astrology to groups of people such as cities and nations. So it's essentially how astrological phenomenon or astronomical phenomenon relate to the country as a whole or relate to world events. Elsewhere or in connection with that, there's also been a lot of discussion amongst astrologers about the fact that this eclipse is actually going to take place very close to the fixed star Regulus at the end of the tropical zodiacal sign of Leo. And that happens to be where the president of the United States, the current president, has his ascendant, which is the most personal and to some extent the most important part of the chart. And so there's great attention being drawn towards the fact that the eclipse, which happens to cross the entire country, is falling on the ascendant of the leader of that country, and it raises a lot of additional questions about its significance and meaning in terms of world events and in terms of politics and other things like that. But that's not really the point of this video, and that's not what I want to focus on. Instead, I'd like to focus on how individuals, how you, the viewer, or other people that are curious about the astrological significance of the eclipse might be able to relate it to their own life in terms of what this eclipse might mean to you personally in your life. And the primary way to do that is by relating the eclipse to your birth chart or your natal chart and viewing the eclipse through the lens of the natal chart by looking at what part of the chart it falls in. So eclipses traditionally, especially in ancient times, used to be viewed, oftentimes, not always, but there was a tendency to view them as negative omens, because part of what happens is that eclipses are something that, from a visual standpoint or from just an observational standpoint, appear to interrupt the order or the flow of nature in some sense. Because what will happen with an eclipse like this, a solar eclipse that occurs in the middle of the day, is that everybody will be going along and living their life and doing things normally, and then suddenly, right in the middle of the day, it'll turn completely dark, as if the nighttime, as if suddenly it's become night out, even though it's still the middle of the day. And there's something that's, from a symbolic standpoint, that can be tremendously sort of unnerving about that experience, the experience of day basically turning to night suddenly for a brief period of time. So there was a tendency in ancient times to view eclipses, especially from a mundane standpoint, as negative omens that indicated major changes or major shifts in different parts of the world, which could include somewhat extreme things like famine or plagues or wars or the death of kings and other things like that. In modern times, eclipses and the interpretation of eclipses amongst astrologers has shifted, and modern astrologers often tend to look at eclipses within the context of the lunation cycle, which is the cycle and the relationship between the sun and the moon in their monthly sort of revolution between each other. And I think that's actually a good way to look at eclipses. So, from that context, each month there's a new moon, which is when the sun and moon reach the same spot in the zodiac, basically. So, according to zodiacal longitude, the sun and the moon will align at a specific spot in the zodiac. And that's the start of the lunar month. So, at a new moon, the moon is at its darkest. And then after that point, the moon begins moving away from the sun, and it starts what they called in ancient astrology, they would refer to this phase over the next 14 days as increasing in light. So the moon starts increasing in light, and it becomes brighter and brighter and brighter over the course of the next 2 weeks until eventually it hits the full moon, at which point it reaches peak brightness. And then eventually after the full moon, the moon begins waning. It begins the waning half of its cycle, and the moon starts getting starts getting less and less bright as it moves towards the next conjunction with the sun. So this monthly cycle, which takes about a month each time, is a very important cycle because it represents symbolically at the new moon the idea of a new start or new beginnings and laying the foundation for the next month, whereas the full moon represents things coming to maturity and reaching a sort of culmination in some sense when the moon moves as far away from the sun as it can in the zodiacal signs and reaches its peak brightness in terms of its ability to reflect life back to people living on Earth. So that cycle is something that happens each month, and you'll get 12 different lunations in a year of 12 different new moons and 12 different full moons. And each of those will fall in a different part of a person's chart pretty regularly in indicating the new moon indicating a little beginning and the full moon indicating a little culmination in each part of the chart that it falls in over the course of a year. So typically one of the ways that you can follow these periods of new beginnings and culminations is by looking at what house the new moon and full moon fall in. So if the new moon falls in the 7th house, you might see a new beginning with respect to the topic of relationships in the person's chart. Whereas if you have a full moon that falls in the 7th house, you might see a sort of culmination of events or things being brought to a state of maturity with respect to relationships at that time in the person's life. Conversely, if you have a new moon in the 10th house, it might be a new beginning when it comes to the person's career and overall life direction. Or if you have a new moon in the 4th house, it might be a new beginning with respect to the home and the living situation, where some new events and circumstances or topics and ventures are sort of initiated at that time. So that's a regular sort of periodic cycle that happens over the course of the year in terms of the new moons and full moons that fall in each of the 12 houses in a person's birth chart. And it's possible to relate those directly to the development of different topics and themes over the course of the year. So where the eclipses come into play is that approximately every 6 months, when the new moon and the full moon take place in proximity within 19 degrees or so, especially when it's closer than 19 degrees or 18 degrees of the north node or the south node. So anytime there's a new moon or a full moon within less than 19 degrees of the north node or south node, then that will be an eclipse. Because what the north node and the south node indicate, or what it represents in the chart astronomically, is the intersection of the path of the sun with the path of the moon. So that normally a new moon is just a conjunction of the sun and moon in zodiacal longitude. But what happens when they conjoin in a new moon, which is in close in proximity to the nodes, is that there's an eclipse because their paths cross basically not just zodiacally in longitude, but also in latitude. So there's 2 different dimensions that you have to pay attention to in order to see if it's going to be just a conjunction where the 2 planets will be roughly in the same spot of the zodiac, versus if it's an actual eclipse where the moon actually passes in front of the face of the sun and obscures it or eclipses it, as the case may be. So, astronomically, that's what's happening with eclipses, but drawing from that basic premise, one of the things that you can immediately realize or begin to see that an eclipse is basically just a new moon or a full moon that's extra special and that has some additional sort of energy about it that lasts longer than just a simple lunar month, because eclipses take place approximately every 6 months. So, one of the ways that you can look at eclipses, I think, that is more productive or more constructive, and that many astrologers, the way that many astrologers look at them, is like it represents a new moon or a full moon, but it's one that's going to have a longer effect, or where the duration of the events associated with it are going to persist for much longer than a typical new moon or full moon might. So that basically means that it's a new moon or full moon that's indicating some new developments and events in a certain part of your life, but they'll tend to be much more momentous or notable series of events than you would otherwise get from just a simple sun moon conjunction or opposition that isn't an eclipse. So that's one of the ways that I would really recommend looking at eclipses and trying to figure out the astrological significance in terms of your own personal life, is seeing where the eclipse falls in your chart and then figuring out what house that's located in. And what you'll find basically is that that eclipse will mark or trigger the beginning of a new sequence of events or a new series of events that will have implications that will last for at least the next 6 months, if not longer. So, for example, sometimes when there's an eclipse, for example, in the seventh house of relationships, I've seen a person who found or started a major relationship at that time that lasted for many years after that. So it's just like a normal new moon in the seventh house where you might have new developments surrounding relationships. But if it's an actual eclipse and it's also hitting a sensitive part in the person's chart more closely, then it might be much more serious or much more major of a series of events that are starting at that time than normal. So if the eclipse falls in the 10th house, it might mark a new turning point or a new beginning in terms of the person's career and overall life direction. If it falls in their 11th house, it might be something related to friendships or their work with groups or alliances or something like that. And you can go through each of the 12 houses, just looking up the standard significations of the houses and directly relate what the eclipse might mean for you based on that. So, of course, there's other things that go along with that, because not all eclipses are necessarily going to be important to every single person. And there's different ways that astrologers use additional techniques in order to filter out which eclipses are going to be more important for a certain person versus which eclipses are not going to be as important. So one of the things is just looking to see if the eclipse is closely conjoining or to some extent even making a hard aspect, like a square or an opposition, to an important planet in the person's birth chart. So especially a conjunction within just a few degrees. So I'd recommend using a tight orb, and most of the astrologers that look at eclipses often say the tighter the orb, the more significant the subsequent eclipse will be. So for example, if the eclipse falls in your 7th house and your natal Venus is in your 7th house, and the eclipse falls within, let's say, a degree or two of your natal Venus, then that just re-emphasizes or further emphasizes that could be an important development related to relationships for you, or that you could be starting a new major relationship at that time. So looking at whether the eclipse hits natal planets in your chart is definitely a key indicator of whether that eclipse is going to be personally relevant for you. Other things like falling on the degree of an angle, like the degree of the ascendant or midheaven or descendant or IC, are also important. Another thing that I would recommend in terms of determining whether an eclipse will be important is looking at annual profections, which I talked about in a previous video, where in annual profections you can use the technique in order to identify which planet is going to be activated in your chart in a given year. And one of the things that I've noticed is that people who are in Cancer profection years or Leo profection years, where the sun or moon are activated as the ruler of the year, those tend to be years in which eclipses are much more important than other years of the native's life. So again, this is an additional sort of filter or additional factor that you can take into account to figure out if this eclipse or other eclipses in the future are going to be personally relevant to you, which is trying to see if the sun or moon are activated for you in your chart in that year using that specific timing technique. So there's a number of other factors, but those are some of the key things that I wanted to talk about in terms of how you might look at eclipses and try and see what the astrological significance is for your life. So there's going to be certainly some events or some world events that are associated with this eclipse that it might indicate or correlate with on a mundane level. But for most people, the way that you want to see if this is going to have a personal impact on your life and the way to relate it to your own life and circumstances is going to be through the birth chart, and especially through the house placement of where the eclipse falls in terms of the 12 houses. So I think that's about it in terms of what I wanted to talk about in this video in terms of the astrological significance of eclipses. If you have any questions or any comments, please leave them in the comment section below and I'll be sure to get back to you. Otherwise, thanks for watching and I'll see you again next time.